Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Alright, so this lesson right here, the beginning of chapter 16, is going to be everything basically that we went over in chapter 15. But it's important to know what the causes of the Civil War are. So this is going to be just a quick review for you in this chapter right here. So what is the first cause of the Civil War? Well, many say it's the only cause of the Civil War. And here's why I say that. Slavery is the number one cause of the Civil War. There's no questions about it. Yes, I understand that when Lincoln became president in 1860, his goal was to preserve the Union. And it's not until later on in the war that the objective of the war was to free the slaves. And we'll get to that, and you'll see that. However, slavery is the number one cause. Remember, the agrarian South used slaves from the early 1600s. By the time 1860 rolls around, there's over 4 million slaves in the South. Slavery was interwound. It was one hand in hand with the economy of the South. The industrious North, small farms, factories, lots of immigrants, they didn't need any slaves. So that's why you have this big difference between the North and the South. The South relied heavily on slaves. Now, when we cover each one of these following examples or causes of the war, you will see that every one of them has a base in slavery. So the next one is the Dred Scott Decision. If you remember the Dred Scott Decision, this is the one where Dred Scott, he was a slave in Virginia, moved to Louisiana, got purchased, moved up to Missouri with his owner. His owner wound up moving to different army bases around. He went to free places, like when he went to Illinois and Wisconsin with John Emerson, his owner. And while he was there, he, by his own free will, decided not to leave his owner, and then he moved back to Missouri. And when he moved back to Missouri, his owner passes away. His ownership gets transferred to his wife, and Dred Scott and his wife Harriet sue for their freedom. And if you remember correctly, Judge Roger B. Taney presides over this in the Supreme Court, and he says that African Americans, free or slaves, cannot sue in the federal government, especially slaves, because they're considered property. And then Roger Taney says that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional because the government of the United States cannot tell certain territories or states that they can or cannot have slaves. Next cause right here is states' rights. If you remember when we covered Andrew Jackson, we covered the beginning, the real strong part of states' rights. You had Vice President John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, who was really upset about the Tariff of Abominations, and he really pushed forward this nullification crisis. The idea that states can nullify laws that they deemed unconstitutional. So you have this division of the power between states and the federal government. A lot of the states feel like they should have the more power than the federal government because the federal government is made up of all these different states. So the focus here is heavily on slavery with states' rights because the South is trying to protect slavery in these individual southern states. So states' rights, again, based on slavery. The abolitionist movement, of course, abolitionists, the attempting of getting rid of, eradicating slavery. By 1830s, you have all these people in the North who want to abolish the slaves. You have to remember, by the early 1800s, I think 1804, 1805, the North had already abolished all their slaves. So you have a lot of people in the North who are now wanting to get rid of slavery in the South. Even though a lot of people up north never really saw what slavery was like in the South, they never witnessed it eye to eye. However, they wanted to get rid of it. They thought that it was the constitutional right to say that, yes, we are right in this over the South. You are not right in this states' right argument. Abolition of slavery needs to happen in our country. Again, abolition, the trying to get rid of slavery. Next one, of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom Cabin, the anti-slavery novel written in 1852. It was originally written in 1851 and published in newspapers and separate articles, finally published as a novel in 1852. Within 2 years, well, actually, within the first year, I think it sells 300,000 copies. Within a decade, it's over like a million copies or something like that. It's sold worldwide in Europe. It's depicting the evils of slavery. Remember what I said about Harriet Beecher Stowe? She lived in Ohio. She lived across the Ohio River, which is across from Kentucky. She was able to interview slaves, talk to the slaves, write it down, find out what life was really like. She was able to see it for herself, hands-on, and she puts it in this book about Uncle Tom, a slave who's wound up beat to death by a horrible slave owner. Again, basis is slavery. You see at the bottom, upon meeting Stowe, it's said to Abraham Lincoln has said that you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war. Remember, that's not proven that he said that, but folklore says that he said that to Harriet Beecher Stowe. Again, Uncle Tom's Cabin, based upon slavery. The Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad really upset the Southerners. Remember, you had Northern abolitionists, you even had free slaves like Harriet Tubman, traveling this Underground Railroad from the south to the north. There's a map right there. It went really all the way up to Canada. You have these conductors, what you would say, taking fugitive slaves, escaping from their plantation, escaping their slave owner. They get with these conductors, they travel to train stations throughout the night, abolitionist houses who would protect the slaves. They would put them in a back room. They would cover the doors so nobody knows that anybody was in there. They would give them food, supplies, make them stay away from law, make them stay away from bounty hunters. Again, the Underground Railroad moving slaves north to freedom. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, you can't forget this one. The Missouri Compromise, what's it based upon? Well, it's going to be based upon slavery again. You remember, we got this land out to the west. Americans moving out west. They're moving to the Missouri Territory. They want to become a state. They meet all the criteria of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 to become a state. They want to become a slave state. In order for the Missouri Compromise to happen, you have Massachusetts, who decides to break off a big part of its area in the northeastern part of the United States. They call it Maine, so they allow Maine to come in as a free state. They allow Missouri to come in as a slave state, and then they decide slavery from there on out above that 3630 line. Remember, if you're above that 3630 line, you're a free territory, you're a free state. Below that 3630 line, you can be open to slavery. So again, Missouri Compromise based on slavery and representation in Congress. That's another thing that we've talked about in this class a lot, is representation in Congress being a very big compromise getter in history. All right, the next thing we're going to cover here, of course, John Brown, Bleeding Kansas. If I remember correctly, the Kansas Nebraska Act made those two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, both above the 3630 line, meaning they should be free. However, Stephen Douglas proposes this Kansas Nebraska Act in 1854 and says that, hey, these lands should be able to vote. Remember, popular sovereignty on the idea if they wanted to have slavery or not. So you have all these people flooding Kansas and voting for slavery. Pro-slavery winds up winning at first. You have the border ruffians come from Missouri. They attack Lawrence, Kansas. This is the sack of Lawrence. They burn down the Free State Hotel. They burn down a lot of buildings over there. John Brown hears about this from Massachusetts. He flies himself, he doesn't fly, he gets himself all the way out to Kansas, winds up killing 5 pro-slavery people in Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. You remember him and his sons crack him on the head with broadswords and kill him, and he is on now. So remember, John Brown goes from Bleeding Kansas, out in Kansas, all the way out east to Harpers Ferry, Virginia, where he tries to do that uprising, that slave uprising, when he attacks Harpers Ferry, tries to steal all the arms, give it to slaves, and have them with this big slave rebellion, but none of the slaves showed up. And John Brown is ultimately captured by Robert E. Lee, future general of the Confederacy. He's tried and hanged very quickly afterwards. You have the election of 1860 with Abraham Lincoln. Remember Abraham Lincoln? He wants to preserve the Union. Southerners don't believe that. They think he's going to get rid of slavery. Abraham Lincoln's not on any of the ballots in the southern part of the United States, but he still wins the presidency. And after Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency, says, hey, you can have slaves. If you have them, you can keep them. I don't want it to spread. Just don't break this union apart. You finally have the South seceding. You have South Carolina seceding from the Union. And then you have 6 states immediately following them: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They all leave the Union, create their own country, the Confederate States of America. They elect themselves a president, Jefferson Davis, and then we go to war. So you have to remember, it's these things, and every one of those has the basis of slavery. This is why we say slavery is the one reason for the Civil War.